Coming up on this week's Eastern Conference edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, we're going to pick up from the Western Conference show yesterday and discuss the top Eastern Conference teams that are under the most pressure to make playoffs. Plus, the Toronto Maple Leafs just announced the re-signing of an important piece of the future. That and more coming up on today's edition of the Locked On NHL podcast. It's your team every day.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another episode of the Locked On NHL podcast, brought to you by the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We are free and available on your favorite audio podcast platform, as well as YouTube, where you can like and subscribe to help the show grow. I'm Ross Levitan, alongside Mike DiStefano. As always, it is the Battle of Ontario edition. Each and every Wednesday, you can find me at Locked On Senators and Mikey over at Locked On Maple Leafs, which is perfect timing because, Mikey, your head coach, Sheldon Keefe, has just signed an extension.
Yeah, we got some breaking news that just popped off as we were logging on to do the podcast. So it looks like Sheldon Keefe sticking around another 2 years. He was under contract this year, so I guess similar to Matthews, they're getting it done a year ahead. So there's no lame duck situation. So he's got 3 more years left as the coach. And look, I mean, I knew this was coming. You know, a lot of Leaf fans knew this was coming. It was just a matter of time. There were discussions earlier this summer about how Brad Treliving, he went when he first took the job, went to Arizona, sat down with not only Austin Matthews, but also Sheldon Keefe to get to know him and decide, okay, is this the coach that I want to keep around long-term, or are we going to try and go in a different direction? And he did, say that he liked Keefe and he wanted to get something done. Sheldon said that something was going to get done. And once they got Matthews out of the way, Sheldon became the next guy, I guess, to hammer out a deal with. And, well, you wake up today, Wednesday, August 30th, and Sheldon Keefe's got a new 2-year extension in his back pocket.
Sheldon Keefe took over for Mike Babcock on November 20th of 2019. The year before, he won the AHL Calder Cup championship with the Toronto Marlies. Do you think the fan base overall has been happy with Sheldon Keefe's strategic moves throughout his tenure as Leafs head coach?
I think it's pretty split, and it's going to be interesting to see the reaction of what the fan base thinks, because there's some that think that Sheldon Keefe continues to get outcoached in the playoffs, considering that they have only won a singular playoff round in his tenure as Maple Leafs head coach. But, he is a really good coach. Like he is somebody who's always, changing up his lines, and he's not afraid to change things on the fly. I think that he's got a pretty good group of coaches below him as well, as assistants. So, I'm a fan of Sheldon Keefe. I'm glad that he's going to continue to be the head coach of the Maple Leafs. There are some things that rubbed people the wrong way last year. I don't know if you remember, they lost a game against the Arizona Coyotes at home, which weirdly enough, the Leafs haven't beat the Coyotes on home ice since like 2001 or something stupid like that. It's insane. But they lost another game and they got pretty whooped. I think it was like a 5-2 game or something like that. And he came out afterwards and he's like, our elite players didn't play like elite players tonight. They got outclassed by the opposition, yada, yada, yada. And then he walked those comments back the next day in the media scrum and almost like apologized for calling out his top players, which I think people liked that he called out the top players, actually gave him a little smack on the PP a little bit, and then he walked it back. And that from there on, I think a lot of people kind of lost respect for Keefe and felt like maybe, the inmates run the asylum a little too much and thought that maybe that means that there's going to be a new coach with a new regime coming in as general manager. But sounds like Brad Treliving, he's probably, I would assume, will speak at some point in the next day or two after this extension. But it sounds as though, from everything that he's said so far, he really likes Sheldon. He thinks he's a really smart guy, and he's one of the young up-and-coming coaches in the league. And the Leafs, according to him, are happy to have him on the bench. So he'll be here for 2 more years. I'm curious, though, to see how split the fan base is going to be.
Only 42, will be 43 when the season starts. Sheldon Keefe, one of the younger coaches, got to be in the National Hockey League. The direct quote from the press release from new general manager Brad Treliving is that Keefe has shown great leadership skills with his staff and our players and has a clear vision for this team and where it needs to go. Sheldon has established himself as one of the top coaches in the league, and I look forward to working alongside him as we head into this upcoming season. I get it from both sides. You don't want a guy in the final year of his contract, just a bunch of distractions for no reason, especially when you're the Toronto Maple Leafs, where money is but an object. So we saw them part ways with Mike Babcock with $25 million left. I think there were 4 years left on his 6-year deal when they pulled the trigger on that. So as much as it is job security in terms of a guaranteed financial income for the next 3 seasons for Sheldon Keefe, he's still going to have to produce.
Oh, 100%. Like this team's, I know they finally got over the hurdle and won their first playoff round in forever this past season. But that's now the minimum going forward, right? Like you can't just make the playoffs anymore. This team has to finally win. And with new management coming in means there's got to be higher expectations to get that done, right? So you got to hope that Sheldon Keefe can figure out a way to game plan and scheme a way to not just win one round, but win multiple rounds. And obviously the main goal is to win a Stanley Cup here in Toronto. So hopefully that, for Leaf fans, they're hoping that Sheldon can put together the right game plan and nucleus and get that done.
Would you say the Leafs are under pressure to make the playoffs this season?
I probably would say that would be the case, Ross. Why don't we take a break and get into it?
Well, we will. But before that, I do want to ask, because every coach has that one decision that they make that the fan base never forgives them for. I mean, you can go back. There's a laundry list with Mike Babcock, but with Sheldon Keefe, what's the one kind of pet peeve that fans have taken to him? Is it playing, a big lane? I feel like typically it's that they'll lean on like a big shutdown defenseman when that young up and coming puck mover isn't getting opportunity. I feel like that's a typical one. But what's the biggest complaint among Leaf fans with Sheldon Keefe?
I mean, outside of other than the one that I mentioned before, where he kind of walked back his comments about the elite players, I would say in terms of like playing time ish is, Nylander and Tavares, just for whatever reason, the last couple of years just have not worked. And he's tried to go back to that well time and time and time and time again. And it just keeps not working. Shocker. But he continues to try and make it work, I would say. And sometimes maybe a little bit gives that line a little bit longer of a leash than we want to see in Leafs Nation. So I would say that might be it. That does frustrate some people where they're like, God, just put Marner with the Tavares and put Nylander with Matthews. The numbers show that combination works best for all parties. Just let's get it done. As sexy it is to see Matthews and Marner together, and it is. They play great together, don't get me wrong, but actually Matthews and Tavares also perform better when they're switched up. So I would say, I guess that in terms of like coaching and line deployment, that probably would be it there. Also, the fact that Justin Hall gets way too much time, but he's no longer with the Maple Leafs, so no one can complain about that anymore.
We call that taking away the coach's toys when you're up in upper management. You take them away and
Kerfoot. Like those were the two players who got too much ice time, according to Leafs Nation, and they're no longer with the team. So I'll be curious to see what Leafs Nation complains about now, though. Of course, there's got to be something, right?
Has to be something, because all coaches are bad at the end of the day. Just let them play shinny hockey out there with the most talented players in the world. But all that to say, the start of the season, we usually get that. There's a little bit more, open ice and higher scoring games before coaches, figure it out and dull it down to the fact where it becomes a chess game. And that's, how you win in the playoffs. So you got to understand that to an extent.
Take the overs early, people. Take the overs early.
And hammer the Coyotes when they're in Toronto. That's what we learned in segment 1. What are we going to talk about next? It is the teams under the most pressure in the Eastern Conference. I set the parameter at making playoffs. We'll get Mikey's list and how he feels the definition of pressure has to be. Next, you're listening to the Locked On NHL podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by the FanDuel Sportsbook. It's the official sportsbook of Locked On. Go check them out at FanDuel. Get ready for the NFL season with incredible offers from FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 to get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Plus, all customers who bet $5 will get $100 off NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. That's a fantastic deal. Now is the best time to join FanDuel. The app is easy and safe to use, and you can bet on everything from spreads to player props and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season with an offer you don't want to miss. It's FanDuel, an official partner of the NFL. Welcome back to the Locked On NHL podcast. I'm Ross Levitan. You can find me 5 days a week over at Locked On Senators alongside Mike DiStefano from Locked On Maple Leafs. Next episode of Locked On Leafs, I'm sure you'll get an in-depth conversation further on Sheldon Keefe signing that extension. And last week, busy week for the Maple Leafs. They signed Austin Matthews to the richest AAV contract in the NHL. But now, what will that pressure produce? Of course, the Leafs are on my top 5, but let's start at 5 and count them down. Mike, what do you have as the team under? Well, you know what? No, rewind that. End it. We want to put the pressure on immediately. Which team is under the most pressure? Who has to make the playoffs, has to produce going into this season?
So we've set this pressure ranking as like 6 as playoffs, right? Not cup contention, playoffs, correct?
If you want to change the parameter for yours, I very much get that. And maybe you can put with each team what the pressure point is, because it doesn't have to be the same for each. But basically, let's put it like this. If team X doesn't complete goal Y, changes have to be coming next year.
I like it. All right. So in that case, I mean, I still do have Toronto as, I mean, it's the pressure cooker of the NHL. They're always going to be pressure. And for a team that just paid Matthews, they just extended their coach, they brought in a new GM, they brought in some new pieces. I mean, this is a team that needs to find some success, right? They finally got over the hump and won their first playoff round last year. Now they got to find some success. And now the goal is Stanley Cup. I mean, it always has been, but they finally got that first win, right? Now they realize, okay, this is what it takes to win a round. Then they realize, okay, we can't take the foot off the pedal in round 2, though. We got to keep it going. So there's pressure for them to prove that they can not only win 1 round, they can win 2 rounds, but they can maybe make a run all the way to the Stanley Cup. So I think when we look at pressure to win, I would say a championship. I think there's no team that has more pressure on them this season, again, than the Toronto Maple Leafs. So for me, they're up at the top for the team facing the most pressure.
So you don't think because they got over that initial hump of winning 1 series for the first time in 19 years that it takes a little bit of pressure off? You think it almost exacerbates the issue that, hey, you got to get further?
You know why? It's because they played so terribly in that second round and just got mopped up with. That's why I think that it's important for them to get back into the playoffs and, show basically that they can do more than just that. If they would have had a respectable series against Florida, then I think people would be a little bit more on board with Toronto. I mean, there still is going to be pressure. It's Toronto. But I think because they got embarrassed so badly in that second round series, I think it kind of took a little bit away from that first round win. And now it's left a sour taste inside of Leafs Nation. So I think that they need to really go out and have themselves a heck of a season, especially with these kids getting a little bit older.
And not only that, but outside of Matthews, their next 5 highest paid forwards are either up next season or like going into their final year or going into their second final year of their contracts. William Nylander, just this 1 year left on his deal. Mitch Marner, 2 years left on his deal. And we know they brought in those hired guns in Tyler Bertuzzi and Max Domi as UFAs. And then on the back end, they've only got 3 defensemen signed beyond this year. And one of them is Connor Timmins, who's making 1.1. So there is a lot of flexibility beyond this year, let's say, for the Toronto Maple Leafs. But what they have on their side is youth, which the team that I'm going to highlight on my first most pressure cooked team. Go ahead.
Really quickly, one last point there on Toronto, just because you mentioned, the situation with all the players not having a contract. Another one of those guys is William Nylander, who has not signed an extension yet, right? We got Matthews done. We got Keefe done. Nylander's the last guy to get it done. And if you listen to 32 Thoughts podcast last week, he did a sit down with Elliott and Jeff Merrick, and he's basically like, "There's no rush. I got a whole year to figure this out. There's no rush." This team has always wanted to win with this group, and if they don't get it done this year, there's a possibility that Willie walks for more money at the end of the summer, and it's the last chance for them to get it done with this group and this core. That's another reason as to why there's a lot of pressure on this specific team this year.
And not only that, but there is pressure because Kyle Dubas made it so these guys all went to UFA right after their second contracts. They weren't able to negotiate that RFA like an Elias Pettersson in Vancouver, who's had a similar discussion with Elliot Friedman saying, "Hey, I'm not in a rush." But at least if you're Vancouver, yeah, you're going to break the bank, but at least you know that he can't just walk July 1st and go wherever he wants. And I bring that up for a reason because Kyle Dubas is the general manager of the team under the most pressure for me because age is not on the side of the Pittsburgh Penguins, but talent is. They should have the best power play in the league next year, right up there with Edmonton. If you have Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, Chris Letang, and Erik Karlsson all in the same power play, throw in Jake Gensel there, an incredible goal scorer as well, there's no reason for them not to be able to make one final push. You're looking at a 100-point defenseman coming in and actually saving money off the cap this year, the way they were able to maneuver and get rid of some high-priced guys, the Mikael Granlunds of the world and others. Like, there's no excuses if you're Pittsburgh, and this could be their last dance, not with this core, but like full-on rebuild. Like, they have nothing coming up in the prospect ranks because they've had so much success over the last number of years.
No, you're exactly right. There's so much pressure on this team to win now. It's almost like the last dance, right? Like you take that Michael Jordan reference from the doc there, and it truly is. I mean, these guys aren't getting any younger, and Kyle Dubas, although he's a first-year general manager in Pittsburgh, he was brought in and clearly brought in with a motive to win first. If you look at the moves that they have made, it's to win this year, right? Like they added guys who add a little bit of depth to this lineup to win now, and some superstardom in the case of Erik Karlsson. So I will be curious to see how that all goes. Last year, both Gino and Sid actually played the full season, and they missed out on the playoffs. So it's not even as though you could say, well, injuries to Gino and Sid, and they only missed out by a point. They played the whole year. There are injuries elsewhere on the team, obviously, and they got pretty crap goaltending. But guess what? It's the same goalie who's coming, and injuries are always going to bite you.
And the same goalie's making more money now because they re-signed Tristan Jarry to a 5-year deal, making $5.375. And I mean,
there you go.
They gotta hope he's rebounding. If he has a .909 save percentage, they ain't making playoffs.
That's a big bet. That is a big bet to make on Tristan Jarry for Kyle Dubas. So absolutely, there's going to be pressure on them. I had them as my second most pressure-packed team as well. So, and it's strange, isn't it, that you're a brand new general manager in a city, and already you're considered to be a team with the most pressure on them to win, not just make the playoffs, but like legitimately, like this team's got to win, or else that's not going to happen for many, 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 many years, you would think.
12 of their 18 skaters, not counting goalies, 12 of their 18 skaters right now are over 30. Yeah, I feel like that's unprecedented. That has to be the most in the National Hockey League, especially when you look at their highest paid forwards. Their top 8 forwards are all 30 or older. Like that's, I don't even know what to say about that. It's just a matter of like, hey, these guys are super talented. Now go out and do it.
And that's after moving out, like, Granlund and some other pieces that were older to try and facilitate some of the moves that they made this summer.
Yep, they did bring in Ryan Graves, 28 years old, to a long-term deal. So basically, they are going with the left side lock on the back end, right? Graves and Pettersson, both really good at, blocking, playing defensive hockey. And then they are just going to let Erik Karlsson and Chris Letang roam all over the place, is how I guess. So, hey, I know Guy Boucher's on the bench in Toronto, but I'm sure Kyle Dubas, a known Sens fan, was watching the system back in the day where Erik Karlsson had his best year, where he literally did not worry about defense at all, but it didn't matter because he was doing so much at the other end of the ice. So Pittsburgh Penguins certainly under a ton of pressure. I had Toronto up there as well, Mikey. So we'll say those are 1, 2 in whichever order you'd like. After another quick break, we're going to get into 3, 4, and 5 on our list of which teams in the Eastern Conference are under the most pressure to get it done. Welcome back to Locked On NHL. I'm Ross Levitan alongside Mike DiStefano. A reminder that you can find all of the Locked On NHL podcasts wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, where we'd like you to like and subscribe to help the show grow. Whenever something happens, local experts on the biggest stories will take you through the ins, outs, the good, the bad, and lots of great interviews as well throughout the channel. So make sure you are subscribed to your favorite team and your least favorite team, because all comments do just the same. Now, let's talk about more teams under pressure. Who's number 3 on your list?
So this one's a little bit different for me. I'm talking strictly, I guess, pressure to finally win a cup, because this team has been in contention for years, but just continually they just continually come up short. And it may surprise you, but like I think the Carolina Hurricanes are finally gonna be under the microscope here. Like, they're one of the top teams in the NHL, and they continue to get eliminated pretty early. So I think Rod the Bod and crew, this has to be a year where they finally take that step and maybe make a run to the Stanley Cup, because if not, it'll be another year wasted. And they're getting into that San Jose Sharks kind of territory where it's like, hey, every year they're good, right? Every year they win a couple of playoff rounds, but they can never really make it out of the West, or the Sharks. But the Canes never make it out of the East. They never make it all the way to the Stanley Cup. So I think that Carolina is going to have the pressure turned up quite a bit this year, I think.
Yeah, no, I like that answer. I think that they also are in a place where flexibility is there beyond this season. They only have 3 defensemen signed beyond this season, and all of them are only signed for 1 extra year. So you look at, they went out and they addressed their biggest need, or what they thought was their biggest need, which was 1 more defenseman. Dmitry Orlov was so good with Boston after being traded there from Washington. He also brings a experience of winning that cup with the Caps back in 2018. So I like their makeup. They obviously got Tony DeAngelo back at a much more reasonable price for a guy who only brings offense and absolutely nothing on the back end. He'll actually hurt you defensively, but if you offset that and play him with a Jacob Slavin, maybe you're able to get the most out of that pair, although Slavin and Burns played pretty well together last season. But they've got options back there. They brought back Freddie Anderson on a 2-year contract. They brought back Antti Ranta on a 1-year deal. Obviously, they've got that young stud, Kochkov. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Why don't I just call him Piotr? I like that. Good handle on him. They've also added my least favorite player in the National Hockey League, but I won't take a bite out of naming him. But you look at the top end guys, they still have it. Do you think they have a superstar though, like Sebastian Aho on that level?
I don't know if he, like, superstar may be a touch high when you're talking about him, and it kind of, the market's also never really going to allow a superstar to grow there, I would assume. But I think he's definitely a star. Like, he's a perennial all-star in this league. Like, he's a guy who you can certainly, build around. And I think they've done a pretty adequate job in doing so. Svechnikov is a goal-scoring machine. He wasn't healthy last year, so he's healthy this year. That's obviously going to help. Teravainen's a pretty good player. They brought in Michael Bunting this offseason, so we'll see what Mike Bunting can do for them.
Yeah, Leaf fans told me last year he was a superstar. I guess not anymore.
He was never a superstar.
You was telling me he had more points than McDavid 5-on-5.
He should have won the Calder. He should have won the Calder, and he did have more points than McDavid at 5-on-5 in his first season in Toronto. That's true.
You know how you get a Stanley day with the Stanley Cup? Would they let him bring the Calder Trophy to the old folks' home he stays at?
Oh, God, he never won, so no.
Exactly. There you go.
Give it to you. Was it Mo Seider won that year? Maybe
yeah,
Mo Seider. I think Mo Seider won. Either way, yeah. So I think that they're a solid squad, and every year they're in contention to win the Stanley Cup. And at some point, you got to burst through and actually do it, or at least get to a cup final, or The organization's going to sit here and say, all right, we got to break up this nucleus. Like this something needs to change, something drastic, because we keep adding around the peripherals. But I think a drastic change potentially might be the course of action if they don't get something done this year. So that's why I think there's some pressure.
But remember, they did not get swept by the Florida Panthers. It wasn't a sweep, per head coach Rod Brindamore.
Yeah, it wasn't a sweep. Like, if you watch the tape, it wasn't a sweep. Like,
no, but the same team celebrated after all 4 games, and then the series was over.
Yeah, but, if you watch the tape, though, Ross, like, wasn't a sweep, though.
Wasn't a sweep. Well, I mean, the Leafs can say that because they won a game, but
I forgot about that line, actually. That was an all-timer. It's like, wow, really? That was almost as bad as our best players didn't play like our best player. That was something.
Yeah, that was tough. I like that, though. Carolina, not on my list, but I think it's very fair, especially they're the kings of round 2 and obviously got to round 3 this year, unable to get any further. I'm going to go just quickly on this one. The Washington Capitals, I think as Ovechkin gets older and Father Time remains undefeated, they have to strike again while he's still producing 40-plus goals a year. I think it's as simple as that. They obviously haven't been in draft positions over the number of years until this year where they got a top 10 pick. And he's not going to – Ryan Leonard's a great prospect, but he's not going to help them out this year where they need – I don't know what's going on with Kuznetsov. I had heard he was asking for a trade, that he wanted out. Is Backstrom back? How good or if effective he'll be if he's able to play? So they're getting older, man. TJ Oshie's getting older too. Like, that's another aging core that do they have one more run in them before a team like Buffalo, Ottawa, Detroit, these teams who have been rebuilding are going to pass them. And like they did last year, is missing playoffs.
It's weird, though, because you kind of got the inkling last year. They've kind of sold off some pieces, right? Like, they moved out Orlov. They were sellers for the first time in basically the Ovechkin era. And you kind of got the feeling like maybe they're willing to take a step back to try and, I don't know, think about the future. And at this point, it's really just, let's get Ovi past Gretzky. And that seems to be their main objective. I don't know if winning is necessarily the main objective. Like, this isn't really a team I look at and think to myself, oh yeah, they got a chance to win and make the playoffs. Like, it's a stacked Eastern Conference now. Like, that's the thing. Like, 10 years ago, the West was stacked and it wasn't that difficult to win in the East. That's not the case anymore. And they're in a very tough Metro division, and it's going to be so hard to win in that division. And then you even think about the teams who are coming up in the Atlantic. Like, you've got teams like Buffalo, you got the Senators, the team that you cover. Like, those teams are looking to make the jump and make the playoffs here. I don't know if I see Washington as a playoff squad this season. And they got a new coach, so like, does that put more pressure on them? I'm not sure. Maybe a little less pressure. I don't know. I didn't have Washington on here. I understand the Ovechkin part of things, but just feels like organizationally last year they kind of took a step back and were okay with it.
Who has more pressure under than you, or to you then, in the Metropolitan to push for another playoff spot? Washington or the New York Islanders, who also have an aging team?
I got the Islanders on my list here, actually, up next. So I think that this is a squad that, when you look at their front office, like, I mean, they kind of are getting to a point where it's, we might need to move on from this squad. Like, Lou Lamoriello, I don't think he doesn't have that much longer of a leash after the moves that he's been making over the last couple of seasons. I mean, you even look at the deals that he made this offseason. I am maybe one of the biggest Pierre Engvall fans in the city of Toronto. I think he's a decent player. He's a good bottom six guy who can break the puck out and not do a whole lot else. To give that guy a 7-year deal and make him part of your core is wild. I know it's only $3 million AAV, but the fact that you've identified him as a player you want here long term for 7 years, a guy who's already like 25 years old, 26 years old, and you're like, yep, that's the player we want. It's like, really?
It's a Nick Paul deal.
But Nick Paul actually, has done some things in his career and has scored some goals in the playoffs, unlike Pierre Engvall, who I think maybe has 1 goal in his entire playoff career. That's a team to me that there's going to be pressure for them to succeed. There's going to be some changes next offseason in that front office.
All right, give me one more team, Mikey.
Yeah, I think it's got to be. This is a coin flip here. Okay, you tell me which one you think has more pressure, the Rangers or the Panthers. I couldn't decide which team has more pressure. For the Rangers, it's to win a cup. Obviously, I think you look at that squad; it's another aging team. They brought in a new coach to try and get it done and get them over the hump. But they're so good on paper, and we've been fans of them for 2 years now.
Super fan.
And like we're betting on we're using our money, our hard-earned cash, and betting on them on FanDuel, and they keep letting us down. It's very, very frustrating. And at some point, it's like, come on, you gotta win some games here. You gotta go on a run and potentially win a Stanley Cup. So I think the Rangers are a team. But I mean, the Florida Panthers, there's got to be pressure for them to get back on their horse, right? They just went to a Stanley Cup final. So for them, I think they're thinking we got to make the playoffs at the very least. And look, I crapped on Florida. I didn't even think they were going to make the playoffs last year. That was like my hot take, and they went on to go all the way to the Stanley Cup final. But this year, there's some injuries there early on, and there's going to be some adversity on that group. But ultimately, you can't go from being a cup finalist to not making the playoffs, right? So that there's going to be some pressure there on them as well.
Florida and the New York Rangers both plus 2,000 to win the Stanley Cup. That's the tied for 10th best odds. They're also tied with the LA Kings and Pittsburgh Penguins. That is over at FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the Locked On Podcast Network. Carolina actually has the highest odds in the Eastern Conference, plus 950 to win the Stanley Cup. Only Colorado is higher at plus 850 for them to win the Stanley Cup. My final team, and I just feel like changes are coming either way with the new owners, but I have to bring up the Ottawa Senators here as a team that's missed the playoffs in 7 consecutive seasons. And fans are starting to get a little disgruntled, I'll say. I think that there was a collective buy-in from from the fan base to be like, okay, it's going to be bad. It's going to be real bad. And then you have to show that you can get out from under it. Now, maybe a little nugget for people. If there's a new general manager, if there's a new assistant general manager at the very least, or president of hockey operations hired in the next 2 weeks, you heard it here first. I believe that Michael Andlauer, the new owner, is getting the keys on September 10th. Give or take. He just needs final approval. And we're already hearing they've hired an analytics director, a guy who was with him in Hamilton and then worked for Sportlogique. And the rumblings are more changes are coming.
What was he was big on Twitter back in the day, Sean Kearney.
Starting hockey. I Twitter searched his name and then sends. There's some hilarious ones. I won't read them on air, and I didn't tweet them out because I don't want to sewer this guy who just got hired, and everyone's excited for him to hire. A lot of them are very fair, though, with the way that the team's been run in the past. So, yeah.
Maybe send them over my way, and I can bring them up on Locked On Leafs and be like, look at this. Look at these guys. They're hiring just people who bury them all the time.
Oh, yeah. Basically talking about bonehead decisions that the management team's made. I was like, dude, that's the same management team that you just for now. But the big name to keep your ear on is Steve Stais, who obviously has a long history with Michael Andlauer as well. And just randomly 3 weeks ago, when Jeff Jackson, McDavid's agent, got hired as president for the Edmonton Oilers, all of a sudden Steve Stais' name was no longer on the team website. So
I did notice that.
Don't be surprised if he's a member of the Senators, but the changes I would say, unless it's an unbelievable year for him, I think the conversation, if Ottawa can't make the playoffs, will be surrounding Thomas Chabot after this upcoming season.
Do you think, and maybe this is more so a conversation for another show or for Locked On, but how much of a leash does Pierre Dorion have? Or do you think it's possible that he could actually get let go before the season even begins?
I mean, he's a 3-time guest on LOSP, so we like to, take care of our own. But at the same time, I could see the benefit of keeping him. I could see the benefit of moving him. I think if I was in charge, I would hire a president of hockey operations to oversee him. I think that Pierre Dorion has done a lot of good in his time in Ottawa. But
would Stais be ready for that type of role?
I don't know if I would go that far, but maybe as assistant GM, and then you play around with that. But obviously then if you're Dorion, you hear footsteps and kind of the writing's on the wall, right? At that point. But I do think that this is a make or break year for him as well, because he's got a lot of leash Like, he's the 4th or 5th longest serving GM in the league. He made the conference final in year 1 and then hasn't made playoffs since. And obviously, you know where the biggest problem with them is identifying bottom 6 talent and basically the guys who you need analytics departments. And do you know that hiring was the first full-time analytics hiring by the Senators? It's 2023, dude.
I know. It's wild. It's wild, man.
Kraken have like 15 people in their analytics department. Yeah.
It's all about the money, baby. It's all about the money. And now the new guys are willing to spend a little bit, it looks like.
That's the play. That's the play. So, hey, lots more to get to this week on Locked On NHL. Power rankings are coming to you next. You're listening to the Locked On NHL podcast. For your second listen, make sure you go check out Locked On Maple Leafs for more on the Sheldon Keefe signing, and Locked On Senators. We've got our organizational value rankings, and changes are on the horizon. But for today, we say goodbye. For Mike DiStefano, I'm Ross Levitan. This has been the Locked On NHL podcast, your team every day.